Concrete panel blocks of flats, or prefabs, Plattenbau, Paneláci, Paneláci bloky, komi blocks, and many other names in many other countries, but they all mean the massively built residential buildings that can be found all around the world, although most commonly associated with the communist Eastern Bloc of the second half of the 20th century. The buildings are of course not exactly fancy on the outside, and to an untrained eye they all look the same, because there are just tens of thousands. That is one of the most popular complaints about them today, complaints that started to be louder and louder towards the end of the communist rule in Central Europe. So, what happened? In this video, let's dive deep into why the buildings look like they do, what were the original intentions versus the hard reality, and how this evolved over time. In our city of Altengrad, we will leave that place for now and move to another location to build another brand new residential estate made of panel blocks of flats, to have one of them on each side of the city. This one will be the youngest, therefore it will have distinctively different urbanism compared to the rest, more typical of the mid to late 1980s. I made a huge urbanism evolution video, episode 72, link in the description if you want to learn more about that topic. But now, let's talk about why the buildings look like they do. I could start the video with just saying because communists needed them cheap and quick to build. Done. Next question, next video. That's what the usual simplified explanations of this topic are, but that's of course not good enough for us, is it? Now, that answer is kinda true, but obviously the whole problem comes down to just how cheap and quick are we talking about, and what are the implications of pushing it cheaper and quicker. Because you cannot just squeeze an ordinary approach to building. At some point, a complete overhaul of probably the entire mindset and whole country's system, economy is needed. And that is probably the absolute core of two things related to the block housing: standardization and of course prefabrication, combined with central planned economy. I already talked about the beginnings of prefabrication before the Second World War, but just to quickly summarize it, the main goal was to provide affordable housing, not only through cheaper construction, but also cheap labor, since workers would not build it for long. It very quickly became clear that prefabrication was not easy, and doing it in the initial Spartan conditions, usually just next to the construction site without much specialized machinery, did not help the construction process much. A massive industrialization of the process would be needed, meaning huge factories and basically assembly lines that would churn out prefabricated panels and nothing else. This inevitably meant standardization. That was nothing new, since plenty of industries already started making heavily standardized products in modern factory processes, like most famously cars, but also clothes, shoes, radios, furniture, weapons, and so on. But how much standardization is needed or possible? Let's say a shoe factory can at the very least make a single model, although they need to make various sizes. Same applies to car manufacturer, although one size fits all. And same applies to the minimum in industrialized housing. This minimalistic industrial production is of course always going to be highly efficient. One machine making one thing, humans doing exactly the same tasks, so low chances of mixing things up. Huge potential for crazy optimization, no need for additional or customized design. It's overall a manufacturer's dream, really. You could probably go even further and much more political. Would it be better to just cheaply make one shoe model that everyone would wear, because it could be made super efficiently and as a result it could likely reach more people? So on one hand, everyone would wear the same shoes, but more people, maybe even all, would have access to them. It's starting to sound like touching a certain political ideology, isn't it? Well, it's not a coincidence. Unfortunately, those pesky humans are not all the same, they cannot all fit a single-sized shoe, they actually need different sizes throughout their lifetime, and, the worst of all, they have their annoying personal preferences. Well anyways, this example of shoes is quite clear. On one hand, there is the manufacturing and just efficiency of it, not necessarily profit-making. On the other hand, there is, real life, real people. How much variety is good? How much is already excessive? Well, that's up to you to decide. Let's return to housing though. How was it standardized? In a way, housing was always kind of standardized, perhaps not officially, but as a result of just human scale. Person needs some ceiling height, door size, and so on. Le Corbusier, the famous modernist architect, pushed this idea a little bit further. He published in 1948 the modular. It was a geometric system in which he described mathematically perfect dimensions for an average male human, according to which the living space should be designed, so floor height, room area, but also certain furniture and so on. While the modular was probably not directly used much outside of Le Corbusier's work, it certainly is a great example of thinking back in the day that was certainly not limited to just him. To simplify the idea, humans are, after all, roughly the same. They have some exact personal needs and purpose in the city, which can be scientifically or mathematically proven, so we can average it and work with the idea of an average human. Now, on one hand, this might even sound to some people as correct, because it's science, it cannot be wrong, right? I personally don't agree. I don't like many of even today's scientific proofs in housing, not really because the calculations might be wrong, but because the assumptions and inputs frequently are. Not to mention, it all just repeats the average human, one-size-fits-all idea, which doesn't sit well with me at all. But there is also another point. Who decided the average human? Who decided these things? Scientists might be the better option here, because it might have also been a politician or a businessman. So overall, high standardization and high levels of industrialized, centralized production was very much wanted by the Eastern Bloc's communist regimes. It perfectly fit their own ideological backgrounds, and it was very clearly defined what needs to be done, how it must be done, so it was adopted very willingly. But communism aside, architects and engineers all around the world sought to adopt these trends, to build a better world after the horrors of the Second World War and to enter the technologically amazing tomorrow. So it all just fits together. It was one of the rare occasions when almost everyone wanted to do the same thing, or at least the architects and engineers who didn't simply didn't get the chance in the authoritarian environments. So standardization took off. The post-war reorganization of the civil engineering sector was just perfect for it. The whole field was nationalized, design and construction companies were merged, and all required to do as the central planners decided. The brief period of socialist realism architecture in Central Europe from late 1940s to mid-50s did not change this reorganization, although it did pause the massive standardization, as the architectural style required heavy customizations or it just wouldn't work. After it, in the early days of prefabricated blocks of flats, experiments had to be made first, but very soon after, the first mass-produced designs were adopted that would appear in various corners of their countries. This was a huge thing in the late 1950s. Suddenly, you could spot exactly the same building in different cities, in later decades, even in different countries. Before we continue though, I need to explain one extremely important difference between house standardization types: volume and element. Element standardization basically means Lego. You have standardized pieces from which you can build pretty much everything. Element standardization is quite old if you think about it. A clay brick is a standardized prefabricated piece, just a very small one, and bricklayers can break them if needed to make all kinds of shapes. Door frames, some windows, stairs, and so on are standardized even today. Volume standardization, on the other hand, is the standardization of larger blocks, like the entire house, but also smaller pieces can be volume standardized, like entire bathrooms, kitchens, garages maybe, and so on. It's kind of like buying a Lego set, but you are required to build it exactly like in the manual, without any changes. Also, imagine that it would be really hard to use the pieces in any other way. Volume standardization theoretically doesn't require element standardization, but mostly does. Element standardization, on the other hand, does not need to result in volume standardization. The first panel houses of the late 1950s and 1960s were heavily volume standardized. Volume standardization leaves pretty much no room for the architect to change the building. In the early days of standardization, architects complained that they would become catalog pickers, assembling houses from few possible elements. But little did they know that they would not be able to do even that. Some of the early systems did not even offer height or length variations, like the Czechoslovak G40, which can be super easily spotted from above due to the chimney positions and exactly the same geometries in every case. In the Rataje estate in Poznań, Poland, new system was also applied, the Rataje system, although unlike the Czechoslovak G series, this one would only stay in Poznań. But in this single place, almost exactly the same number of houses were built as the G40s in whole Czechoslovakia, around 100. Architects and urban planners of Rataje estate received the volume standardized buildings, and their only quotation marks job was to place them around, although they at least had the luxury of choosing 4 types: 2 lower with just different balcony orientations, 1 higher, and the totally standard tower. Apart from the tower, they could have combined the sections lengthwise, but that's it. The reason for these to be all parallel is also apparently the requirement to simplify crane rails for construction, so in a way that is actually a form of volume standardization too. Even though the very first systems of prefabricated buildings were used in quite large numbers already, they still weren't the most known buildings. When you search the keyword Plattenbau or Paneláci or whatever it is in whatever language, you are most likely going to first see pictures of the truly monstrous productions of the 1970s. We could probably call these later 60s and 70s series the second generation. Engineers collected various new ideas and problems the first generation faced and provided improvements. The number one requirement for this generation was simpler prefabrication. So fewer different panels, quicker manufacturing, and preferably high repeatability to construct them even faster. Thus, systems like the German WBS-70 or Czechoslovak T06B were developed. Poland acquired the German WBS-70 later, plus some Soviet designs. Hungary also imported Soviet technology, plus domestic variants here and there. By this time, the ball was already rolling, and rolling really fast. The entire construction process was fully converted to think and work with standardized prefabrication. But it was at this point when things would get serious. Around the mid-1970s, standardized prefabrication was already criticized in the West and, in its current form, abandoned, although prefabrication in various forms continued. It was also connected with abandoning the modernist urbanism, which kind of went hand in hand with the plain panel blocks, so it's easy to just mix the two and talk about it as one thing. In the Eastern Bloc, however, no such thing happened, just yet. New prefabrication plants were built for the new systems, and the older ones were converted. But this conversion already showed that any kind of improvements or innovations won't be easy. That is why the 1970s designs were not that massively different from the earlier designs. For example, the Czechoslovak T06B still employed the 3.6 meter ceiling panel span to utilize hardware from the previous generation. But new hardware would be able to make various other spans for newer generations much later. German WBS-70 also had to make modifications to initially accommodate hardware for the older P2 system. Just to put things into perspective how much more serious the 1970s construction was, in East Germany there were 50 panel factories making the WBS system, and apparently around 650,000 flats were built in it. So let's do some math. Let's say on average 3 flats a floor, maybe 7 floors averaged across the entire country, and maybe 3 segments or entrances per building. That is of course incredibly rough, doesn't matter, it is some 10,000 buildings. Compare that to the initial 100 of the Czechoslovak G40s or Polish Rataje systems that I talked about earlier. The point I'm trying to make here is that standardized prefabrication not only got huge, but it got ridiculously, unimaginably huge, meaning serious money must have been invested into it, which was also one of the main problems. The industry got perhaps too big and, combined with the entire economic and political system, also quite rigid. Prefabricating a panel is actually, engineeringly, a fascinating process, and it really almost resembles some car factory assembly line, at least in the bigger panel plants. I made an episode about the panel making process, episode 63, if you want more details. Anyway, logically, making a change in this manufacturing process is not easy. The more you industrialize the production, the more you maybe automate it, the more difficult it will be later to switch for some different panel geometries. That is, for example, the reason why in Czechoslovakia the most used system is actually one of the older, the T06B, first used in 1962. One example to explain why. In the Karlsbad region, these were never superseded until the end of panel house building. The reasons were exactly in manufacturing. Panel factories were unable to switch technologies, and state ran out of money to upgrade it, so any kind of innovation in this regard was stuck. And, on top of that, the Carlsbad variant of the T06B is noticeably less improved over the first generation. Although, to be fair, those T06Bs have probably the nicest looking facades, with the heavy use of decorative stone of various sizes and even tones. Not all though, some never got the stones and are, well, noticeably different, let's put it that way. Although the loggia barrier here has those stones, so you can definitely compare the difference. State-created monopoly of the panel manufacturers was a problem. That is already described by architects of the time. It is actually really bizarre reading some interviews. In the mid to late 1980s, the Prague's Southwest City project was being built, urbanistically one of the better places. By the way, the main architect recently passed away in January 2024. He described that he wanted to return to some natural urbanism of the past, so creating streets and squares, and therefore he required corners, and also fairly special 45-degree corners. He had to negotiate with the panel manufacturers to provide that. They were obviously having none of it, so he tried justifying the design in different ways, but eventually he had to pull the political card and argue that corner buildings will allow higher population density, therefore more flats delivered in the housing plan, which finally made the manufacturers budge. What's really great about this story is how he almost described it as discovering fire in the 1980s. Like, oh my god, we can build a corner? Amazing! Czech architects also could finally enjoy the newly discovered wonders of colors, except mostly only one, somewhat dark brown, although in later projects also green. But that's it. If you want different colors, you can just order the panel from different manufacturer. Oh yeah, right. This place perfectly illustrates the whole system. Way too big, way too invested in single technology, and thinking that it is the only possible way forward. The centralized environment could not allow a competing approach. The rigidity of it all then couldn't provide an alternative, and later was unable to provide a meaningful innovation. It was a matter of time before people would have enough of the monotone nature of these new city expansions, and even late 1980s television amplified this critique, which is surprising for the time. They talked about the reality of the buildings, focusing not only on looks, but also lacking quality and some questionable interior layouts here and there, but more on that some other time. East Germans in the mid to late 1980s managed to go much further with prefabricated variations. The overall color palette was surprisingly similar to Czechoslovakia with the dark brown accents, although used more frequently and much earlier. This is a picture from Berlin when even the communist countries realized classic street and block layout does have its urban qualities. So let's complete old blocks with what we can currently build. Just slapping a super standard prefab in there would look silly, so they pushed prefabrication to build highly customized structures like these. Germans also heavily used the ceramic cladding as decoration, even on the standardized versions. Now, compare it with this building from Prague. At the end of the day, the German example is not that super crazy massively different, but it's just interesting enough that I dare say if every residential estate in former Eastern Bloc played with the variations similar to this, people would not criticize the panel housing as much. So clearly, it was possible to use prefabrication to build less monotone houses. Of course it was. Plenty of examples of that from the Western modernism. Unfortunately, standardization and prefabrication were kind of victims of their own initial success. In the 1960s, the regimes simply decided that the technologies are good enough, that's it, simplify it for massive production, we will pour huge money into it and build until we run out of concrete. We have massive urbanization to somehow handle, so chop chop. Volume standardization was pretty much right from the beginning, something only the manufacturers, standardizers and politicians wanted. Architects and arguably final users wanted element standardization, like I explained it before. In one interview, an architect described an ideal situation like this. The manufacturer, preferably not just one, would make a catalog of panels and elements they offer. But it would not be tens of panels, maybe not even hundreds, but thousands. Not necessarily hugely different, but with some geometries done slightly differently, with color and material combinations, and so on and so on. So it would not mean 1,000 different hardware pieces for each product, but modular hardware that can easily change. Plus, structures would not need to be made from 100% prefabricated elements, or at least not from 100% standardized elements. And not every single building in the area needed to be heavily standardized or even prefabricated at all. And that was actually not that far-fetched. This is the Jablitze estate in Prague from mid-1960s, often mentioned as one of the highest quality prefabricated estates in the country. The architect did not settle with the standard houses, but designed custom concrete pillars to raise the first floor, according to Le Corbusier's principles of modern architecture, popular at the time, so people could walk under the building and therefore the building would not obstruct the land. There are also some other elements to somehow break the huge monotone wall of windows, so they included the vertical extrusions. Loggias received that red glass square just to introduce a color, and roofs got the typical custom little covered area where people could go and do things. Window frames were also originally black, just to do things differently than the standardized versions. Unfortunately, the architect of the buildings had to emigrate from the country after the Warsaw Pact invasion. So that's a whole different topic. Not everyone able was allowed to do what they did best. All of those pictures obviously showed the current refurbished state. Yeah, obviously, they are still huge prefabricated blocks of the 1960s. You can think of them what you want, but they clearly show that someone went the extra mile and it was possible. But anyways, let's try to wrap this up. All of this is obviously touching that difficult question. Would there be fewer flats if they were not as plain, therefore fewer people would reach quality housing? Is this all just some vanity, elitist architectural idea that affordable housing should look better? Well, that's for you to decide. I am not exactly sold on the idea that this was the only way and that making the houses more varied would result in significantly fewer of them. But that of course opens a whole discussion about past political leaderships and a whole bunch of ifs. Anyways, I tried introducing the topic of why the prefabricated buildings looked like they did, if they could have looked better, and what was the economic and manufacturing reality surrounding everything. My intention is to introduce you to view these buildings realistically, without the primitive resentment of them, but on the other hand, without the senseless adoration bred mostly out of hate for the current times. At the end of the day, they stand. Millions of people are living in them, and it likely won't change in our lifetimes. But as every part of the city, they also evolve. Let's now see what I'm building over here. If you've seen this place in real life, then you immediately know where I'm taking the inspiration from, because I'm kind of making a one-to-one copy, almost. It is the place in Leipzig, Germany, the Neu-Paunsdorf estate, which started to be built at the very end of 1980s, and if I'm not mistaken, actually finished in the 1990s, so after the fall of communism in East Germany. Although I'm not sure if it was finished before or after the reunification, doesn't matter. What's important about this place is that it's completely different compared to the previous estates, and that is in the urbanism. The buildings are kind of the same as before, although definitely the architect tries to apply more variations. If you look at Google Street View, for example, you can definitely see on the unrefurbished buildings yet that there are those typical 1980s German variations of panels with that typical color palette. So the standard concrete color plus those dark brown accents, but also various kinds of variations with the balcony placements and these kinds of things. The place, obviously it's built in blocks. That's what I'm trying to do over here. So it's ditching, not completely, but mostly ditching that modernist urbanism and returning to that block urbanism of the past, basically. Although we can still definitely see the influences of the modernist layouts, which kind of tells us that this is some sort of postmodernist layout or approach. I'm going to talk more about that in the next episode, actually, where we're going to focus on the architecture of the 1980s a lot more. So that obviously needs to be heavily about postmodernism. But anyway, so that's the layout. You can clearly tell even in Altengrad over here that it is completely different compared to the previous areas. This one is more gritty, more blocky, even though in that, postmodernist sense, it's not completely closed blocks. There are those, functionally separated areas like the shopping centers, let's say, and obviously there is that infrastructure stripe through the center. The real-life place also has a tram. I'm not going to build a tram right now, even though I'm going to detail like a mud path that it's indicating that it's under construction or something like that. Right now, I'm just building these temporary bus lines from the nearest university tram loop just to bring people closer to it. And I'm also extending another bus line through here, the one that actually goes all the way to the nuclear power plant. So maybe this estate is actually intended for the workers. Who knows? It doesn't really matter. It was just a very convenient thing to put that line all the way here because it kind of cuts across the entire city where the tram service is not exactly all that great. Now, detailing wise in this area, this was a very straightforward build, although, and this is actually something that's going to be maybe very important later in some of the videos, because these kinds of places, when I'm building them, they are kind of teaching me one thing. Let's actually talk about the old areas first. So when you are building in city skylines, the old places, the old city blocks, you're basically just going to build the street layout, then you're going to spam some buildings around and maybe detail the backyards, but you're done, right? But these kinds of places, even though the buildings look plain and, you probably think of them what you want, but they are very difficult to put together in city skylines. You can probably tell it from this time lapse, even though it's heavily edited, but it's obviously the infrastructure. But I really heavily need to think about the infrastructure because it's not just some kind of city block where I can do more or less a grid. I kind of need to think about all these different things. At the same time, I cannot do like a simple grid. It needs to have some kind of weird geometry, not exactly uniform. And then obviously I need to place the houses. They need to completely fit the road layout because I only have a few, geometries to play with. And I need to make it so that it's kind of not all that super uniform. It's not exactly the same buildings everywhere. And then I obviously need to do all the empty surfaces. So that's all the pedestrian paths. There are a lot of these pedestrian paths in real life as well as in city skylines over here. Then all the detailing with the networks, do all these like details like these trash cans and things. So that's actually a lot of things. And, this is just city skylines, obviously, but it also kind of translates into real life. Like, these estates were definitely not cheap. And because of all of these things, they are definitely not cheap to maintain. There was actually very recently like a mini series made by one popular Czech architect YouTuber, and he was talking about exactly this. So I obviously saw it, so I definitely did not think of it on my own all that much, but I can see it. I can definitely see what he meant, because just putting the place together in City Skylines, you can discover some of these things, or more like confirm them. But anyway, I'm going to talk about it maybe in some other videos, maybe in the 90s or 2000s or something, where, we must revisit these places and kind of talk more about the current state of them, or something like what to do with them these days, or, something like that. Less focusing on the history, but rather the actual today's reality, right? The series right now is obviously heavily focusing on history, but that's gradually going to change as we're going to approach the modern times. Well, anyway, enough of that. So let's return to some technicalities. Trees. A huge part, obviously, of these places are trees. This place is brand new, therefore trees were just planted, therefore they are small. I really feel like I need to repeat this every single time I do this, because it's kind of like something that City Skylines projects usually don't have, so there you go. And as you could have seen, I just returned to the university area a little bit, because the university place was built in 1960s all the way. I'm not really sure right now. So the trees are already there for some 20 something years maybe, so they should already be reasonably tall. So I just revisited that area, selected all of them, and just increased the scale a little bit to make it distinctly different compared to this new place where the trees are obviously, fresh. Well, all right, so that's it. This place was actually almost bigger compared to that previous 1970s area, the one from the opening shot today. So I kind of needed to limit myself over here to not make it bigger, because I really need to make it look in Altengrad like the 1970s expansion was much bigger. But obviously that previous opening place was not the only 1970s area. So, it's plausible right now in Altengrad that we really did build most of the prefabs in the 70s still. Although I guess that we will have to do some more construction in the 80s of some various places that I really need to a little bit more complete. Anyways, so these are the finished cinematic. Oh yeah, one more thing that also is very different compared to the previous areas. There's a lot more parking over here, which was also the reason why I had so much problems putting this place together, because the game was just crashing all the time. I don't know why, but most of the time when I just touch these custom networks, in this case the parking lot networks that I built with Road Editor, when I touch them with node controller renewal, network multi-tool, intersection marking tools, something happens in the game, and then after some couple of minutes the game just freezes and I just have to shut it down and restart. So I think it happened like 10 times while I was building this area. So yeah, these parking lots were paid for in blood almost. But it's looking all right. I really like the customized corners and all these various places for the trash cans, for example, on the networks. That's usually not what you see in City Skylines. So, just a different detail to make this place look kind of different compared to the different places. It's not just the urbanistic evolution that's evolving. It's also kind of my ability to put these places together. Well, anyway, guys, that's going to be all. Like I said, in the next episode, we are going to take a look at the 80s, more in terms of architecture, urbanistic developments, and evolution, and all these kinds of things. I have one really interesting project or area in the city to redevelop, so stay tuned for that. Well, anyway, that's going to be it. Thank you for watching. If you like this episode, then you know what to do. All the clicking, subscribing, the usual. And huge thanks to channel members. I really appreciate all your guys' support. So thank you again. Take care. Goodbye.